Uh, a very good morning, dear young scholars and participants and faculty member of this GAN program. This is the last day, that is fifth day, uh, and I'm very happy that with your support and cooperation, we have you know, done all the lectures, exercises, and tutorial in the last 4 days. I do hope that on this day we'll have a very good session. So this is the 10th lecture in the series by Alexander Sebastian, and the title is very important: Climate Mobility Literature Review. As I said yesterday, literature review is very important. One need to go through at length. So in that, Alex will show you critical highlight, insight of how to do the literature review, and then we have the two lectures here only. Then after that, we'll go for the lunch, and then the third lecture and valedictory session will be in another, Mir Anis Hall, which is close by. So I hand over mic to Alex. Thank you.
Okay, so this could easily have been titled Review of the Literature or Review of the Evidence rather than Literature Review. Thank you very much. So let's go ahead and get started and go through this lecture. And I'm going to have Rajwal touch this again because he gives the magic touch. I don't know if you have the magic. You do. Okay. Let's see. You do. Okay. All right. Not everyone has that magic, but um, great. Welcome, welcome, welcome. It's hot out there, isn't it, today, folks? My air conditioning cut off at about 5 a.m. this morning. So and then after that, I wasn't really aware until I was like, it was probably 4:30 when it cut off. And by 5, I was like, I'm really hot and really sweaty, and I don't know why this is. And then I was just up. So I'm sure that happens to many of you too. We're going to get through that. So this is, the outline for today. So what is the evidence for climate migration? What are some of the systematic reviews that are out there that have been done? What's the evidence for climate displacement and climate conflict refugee situations? Evidence for involuntary immobility. We have talked a little bit about that, linked to concepts of habitability. And then if there's time, research findings that we produced at our center, but only if there's time. So this is a conceptual or a diagram that I produced when we launched something called the Climate Mobility Network at Columbia University. Oh, by the way, all the slides are already up on the Google Drive, so you can sit tight and relax. You don't have to take pictures. They're all there for you. I won't even be upset if you open your laptop and go along in the slide deck, as long as you're not doing Snapchat and WeChat. It's all good. So I produced this to kind of, it was a collective effort, but it was sort of my thinking about how to distinguish between the different types of mobility that occur in different contexts. So in high income settings down in the bottom, the real issue for most people is jobs, income, economic impacts, and the effects are largely going to be voluntary migration, except there may be conditions where in the middle you have disasters that occur, major fires, wildfires, sea level rise and floods and storm surge, in which case you may get displacement and forced migration and you may even see resettlement and managed retreat. Again, this is the overlapping area between the high income and the low income settings where the issues can be much more pronounced around issues, as I mentioned, involuntary immobility, adaptation in place. We call that in situ adaptation. And then some of the same issues as occur in high income settings around displacement, forced migration, voluntary migration, et cetera. And then each of these has different policy implications. So we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the policy implications towards the end. So what's the evidence for climate migration? We've all seen the headlines. I don't know if these headlines appear in Indian newspapers as well. global alert, there's going to be masses of people on the move, and climate's going to generate all that movement. So if that's, the headlines, what's the kind of evidence behind it? And where are the scientists, and what are the scientists? How are the scientists either confirming or questioning that those narratives and those headlines? The way that has been done up until now, and this is not maybe definitive, but this is the way I group things, is that we have uh, a lot of, some research, relatively limited, that goes back into like prehistory and looks at issues of environmental change and how populations responded to those environmental changes, like the Maya in Mexico and the Roman Empire. We have more recent analog events, analogs meaning, it's almost the same, but it happened about 100 years ago or 50 years ago or something. And it's not, wasn't induced by climate change per se, but the Dust Bowl in the US or the Great Sahelian droughts prompted widespread migration and movement out of certain areas. So people study those events and say, if that's what happened during the Dust Bowl in America, what might happen with a similar drying in the U.S. Today and under climate change. By far the biggest chunk of research is in these statistical analyses, and also to a slightly lesser extent these qualitative studies on the ground where people are interviewing people, they're doing focus group discussions, and they're talking to people. But we're going to talk a bit about these four types. I'll start with just the paleoclimate. There was one or two people who do paleoclimate work here. Can you raise your hands? Awesome. You did the pollen in the Sundarbans. So this is really, really important work where we're reconstructing past climate using proxies like tree rings and things like that. And that's how we get those charts that I showed you in the third lecture, where you see over time the CO2 levels going up and down and the temperatures going up and down. That's all reconstruction using ice cores and all kinds of proxy data. And even ancient texts, can give you some indication. I mean, I've referred to the Bible in some cases. There are huge droughts that occurred, in biblical times. I'm sure in your own texts in India and, Islamic texts, there are similar references to climatic and other events and the impact that that had on populations. There's also archaeological evidence, and people go, digging in ruins and finding out that, people were eating foods at the time that they habited that no longer exist in that area, but because the climate had shifted and changed, those foods, they were at one time available to the populations. I actually made a big mistake. It was a little bit of a, it was an understandable mistake, I guess, but I had something published in Scientific American, which is kind of one of the leading popular science journals in the United States. And I published this, and I said that because of drought, it pushed the Mongols. Okay, you guys know much more about the Mongols than I do, because I visited one of these Mogul. I never made the association between Mongol and Mogul, by the way, but now I know, and my history books have been but I also made the mistake of saying in this article, because I had found some evidence online. It was admittedly not a scientific study. I think it was something that I found that referred to droughts pushing the migrant migration out of the Mongol area north of China. And that, that was what caused the Mongols to expand and go much farther east and go south to places like China. Well, actually, it was quite the opposite. The evidence suggests that it was a wet climate that actually fueled the Mongol expansion. And so this is kind of one of the things that makes climate mobility research so interesting, is you can have a intuitive grasp on something and say, surely it must have been drought, and that caused the all these horsemen to leave the steppes because they didn't have adequate grazing for their masses of horses and their cattle and everything. But in fact, it was the prosperity that was engendered by a wet period. Historians have long speculated that periods of drought pushed the Mongols. So this was where I got my information. But it was actually consistent rain and warm temperatures may have given the Mongols the energy source they needed to conquer Eurasia, grass for their horses. Okay, so that's the that's a kind of journalistic summary, but there was research behind that to show that, in fact, it was a wet period. And in fact, I have had conversations with some of our paleoclimatologists at Columbia talking about some of these very issues. So let's back to, other evidence, and this is more recent analog events. These are the analogs to current climate migration. And, you mostly have heard about these. I mean, one thing that people don't realize about the Dust Bowl in the United States is maybe the size and the impact that this had. So what happened was during the tens, in the teens and the 20s, a lot of farmers pushed into this very dry area of western Oklahoma and Texas, and they started growing wheat and stuff on what was pretty productive land. And so it seemed like a good thing. But what they didn't realize is they were in the middle of a wet period that enabled them to grow crops in that area. As soon as it turned dry again, the soil, the measures they used were simply inadequate for soil conservation. They were plowing up land that really shouldn't have been cultivated. And so when it turned dry again and the wind started blowing, dust clouds started forming. I read books about this. They basically, like for days on end, they would be inside their houses with their windows taped shut because every crevasse, every cranny that would allow dust to get in, dust would form on everything that they had in their house. Anyway, long and short, eventually, the only reason Congress acted, and maybe this is a sign of what's going on today too, is Congress only acted when the dust clouds went all the way from Oklahoma to Washington, D.C. So one day they woke up and there was a huge cloud of dust coming from the Midwest. And then they said, oh, you know what? Maybe we should form something called the U.S. Soil Conservation Service. The U.S. Soil Conservation Service would help us to avoid these kinds of catastrophes in the future. So that's often how policy happens, folks. It's when it's in the wake of some disaster. And of course, one of the repercussions of this was we had masses of migrants going out to California, settling in California. Now they've depleted the water resources there. No, I'm just kidding. But, we had what they called Okies, Oklahoma, people from Oklahoma going out to California. You can read about that in John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. Other things, like I was in the second of the Great Sahelian droughts. I was there in Mauritania. I saw the dead animals strewn everywhere. I saw, the parched land. And then I actually was there for the first return of the monsoon. But what happened was there was a dust cloud like the one of the Grapes of Wrath that was so great that I had to run into my room and shut the door for 24 hours because it was, the dust. It wasn't just dust, mind you. It was also all those dead animals and all the fecal matter and everything else that was being blown my way. But other countries have experienced similar droughts and also seen massive migration out of dryland areas into cities and other places. So one of the leaders in the field of climate mobility is a guy named Etienne Piguet. You might have heard his name. He's at Lausanne in Switzerland. We've interacted a fair amount over the years. And one of the things he's done is sort of done these systematic reviews of approaches that people are taking to do studies. So he talks about 4 types of studies. One is ecological inference analysis based on area characteristics. Another is individual type 2 sample surveys where both migration and environmental data is collected at the individual or household levels. So the first is area-based, the second is household level. I'm going to show some diagrams that help you to depict this in a second. Type 3 is time series analysis, which measures the correlation in variables over time. So you have the environmental variables, you have the migration variables. That's relatively rare. And type 4 is multi-level analysis that differs from type 2, only that the environmental data is collected at the ecological level, so at the level of the state or province, but you get survey data collected from the households themselves, and you find out whether people moved or not, or what their perceptions were of that event. So here's a diagram depicting each of these. Aerial level work is great, but it can suffer from what's called the ecological fallacy, which is the notion that an event that occurs over like some change that's occurring let's say one classic ecological fallacy uh, has been, that deforestation in the Amazon was due to population growth. And you look at the large scale change in population, and you look at the large scale change in deforestation, the decline in forest cover, and you look at those two things and you say, well, therefore, population is the main reason. There are other cases where the inference from the population level effect to the individual is questionable, and that's what the ecological fallacy is about. But that is a commonly used approach, and there's nothing per se wrong with it as long as you acknowledge the potential for ecological fallacy. The other approach is where the ecological data in green, these circles, and the household data are actually closely matched. So you have data like from remote sensing for the area around the household, like what's going on with greenness, dryness, flooding, that kind of thing. And you actually match that at a pretty close spatial scale to both where the household is and where their livelihoods are, their farms, their pastoral lands, etc. The third type is these panel series where you basically take the aerial approach, but you look at it over time. And then the fourth type is where you have only area level data, and then you have survey data for the households. Okay, I don't know if that makes sense. I have looks of puzzlement in the audience. But again, these are like the four primary approaches that are used. Like I said, some of these are more subject to the ecological fallacy. These ones where you're using aerial level data. If you don't know about it and you're a geographer, you should look up ecological fallacy. That's all I can say. Should also look up modifiable aerial unit problem and study that and learn about that. But we won't go into that right now. So flow data. There are different types of data that you can use. So one type is movement from unit X to unit Y over time period Z. We've talked about different data types. These could include things like IOM does flow monitoring. They have data on flow monitoring in the Sahel. Immigration or asylum statistics might give you some indication of how many people are moving from a given country to like the US or Europe. Border apprehensions data, we've worked with those kinds of data in the US using border apprehensions, stock differencing methods, and migration matrices from censuses. So these all represent flows, whereas stock data is the count of migrants or the non-native population from unit X and unit Y at a given time. And then change data include change in relative allocations of urban rural populations. So it's basically looking at how populations are changing and inferring migration based on that. I've heard also, well, I have Fabien Coutier, my postdoc, former postdoc, now associate research scientist and soon to be professor at the University of Geneva, has used data on ethnic composition from the demographic and health surveys in Africa. Why is that? He could use it because he knew that all the co-ethnics of a particular group typically were from a certain region of a country. And if you had someone from that ethnic group in another region of the country, it meant they had migrated there. They had actually moved there. So he could infer migration from that. There's also issues with each of these data types in accounting for return migration and also births to migrants. So migrants move, then they have families and they have births, and so they're the second generation. So that's an issue that occurs in many types of data. So these are kind of standardized statistical, this is examples of standardized statistical studies. I'm not going to go into all the coefficients, but what I will note is that this is using interprovincial migration in South America from 1970 to 2011, and they're basically looking, they have different data sets, so they're not all consistent, but they had these migration-related data for different countries, and then they looked at changes in things like monthly temperature, rainfall above certain standard deviations, etc., and tried to identify whether any of these things explained the change, the migration from one province to another. So it was a fairly sophisticated study. I think the main point that I will make is that you'll notice that these coefficients vary from country to country very heavily. So results may vary. I don't know if you've heard that expression on TV. We always, whenever they do something on TV with a product, they say, use this product, but results may vary. So results may vary because it depends on the country and it depends on the socioeconomic factors in that country. And maybe the economy is downturned at that time. So some of the climate inference they're drawing is really from a downturn in the economy in province X and people move to province Y. So they don't control for all those factors fully. This is a good example of work that looked at drought and heat months in Mexico. So Rafael Narwatsky, who I've also worked with, is really been responsible for some of the very strong statistical analyses. And so one of the things you'll notice is that when the number of drought months increase for each additional drought month, it increases the odds of migrating by 3.6%. So that's in Mexico, and that's within Mexico, internal migration within Mexico. Also, for after 34 heat months, right around here, this inflection point, outmigration increases. So you have higher probabilities of migrating, at lower levels of heat or numbers of consecutive heat months. And these are months above some standard deviation. So these would be measured as consecutive months where temperatures are definitely elevated above a norm. And so after a certain number of heat months, you start seeing movement out of and from rural to urban areas. And then he also, I think, very helpfully looked at things like rural to rural migration and urban to rural. I mentioned that each of these different types exists to certain degrees in different contexts. This is probably one of the most ambitious meta-analyses. And a meta-analysis is basically, unlike a systematic review, a meta-analysis seeks to standardize all the variables and use standard effects. So they could use standard effects for the environmental variables and look at how climate change affected or climate variables or deviations from the norm. Normally it's anomalies or different deviations from the norm of climate in the past affected things like international migration on the top and internal migration on the bottom. And you can see, depending on the study, you get either negative effects of things like precip. In this case, it was precip only. Barrios et al., negative effects. So that would be suppressing migration internally, or statistically significant increases based on precip and temperature. And the reason these numbers exist is that each one of these studies has a number of units of analysis. So they're not always just looking at one unit of analysis. They're using a pooled sample, as it were. And so anyway, similarly, international migration, you get positive effects in some of these studies for these variables. This would be a rapid change of some sort. I forget which one it is. And negative effects. So again, there's a lot of variation. Results may vary depending on which country, but you can pull all of these together and start getting a little bit better picture of what's going on. So these are the distribution of the precision-weighted standardized effects across the entire pool of all those studies and all the sub-studies within those papers that I referred to. And you start to see that indeed temperature change results in more movement, positive movement, migration out. And precipitation variability also is important, but it's not quite statistically significant. It crosses this, the box plot crosses this line. And I would say rapid onset, that's the rapid that I forgot about the name for, but rapid onset disasters also are statistically significant and positive in terms of inducing migration. One thing that he also pooled the sample according to whether you're middle income or agriculturally dependent economies, And basically, if you're agriculturally dependent, if your the studies were in agriculturally dependent economies, you see a much higher correlation between the environmental variables and the migration. Finally, they map this globally, and so you can see regions like India where there's a very high predicted migration as a result of environmental variables. Brazil is also important, and a lot of Africa. So this is just kind of a nice overview piece. If you can pull that from the literature, I think it's worth reading. He subsequently worked with some Barbara Sedova on some similar analyses, and I think an even larger pool of studies, and so you might want to check that out as well. So they discovered the following things: that temperature and precipitation both matter, but temperature increases have been more consistently correlated with outmigration. But specification and timescales matter. High temps have impacts on ag production. This is what we call the agricultural pathway in the climate mobility literature. You'll read a lot about agricultural pathway. I wrote an article about a year ago that also dealt with the agricultural pathway. I think I mentioned the missing middle portion of these studies, that basically you just have the climate variable and you have the migration variable, and then inferred from that is that there's some change in crop or other things, that there was a decline in crop production. So there needs to be more careful analysis in this area. So temperature increases will typically increase your evapotranspiration and may lead to drought. So that's one reason why I think temperature is so important. Climate effects vary across space and time, but we still don't understand why this is. My view as a geographer is that it's all about, location, location, location. So I sound like a real estate agent, but I'm actually a geographer, and it's all about what's going on in a local area. Finally, warning, statistical research needs to be contextualized. So I edit this Frontiers in Climate. I'll just put a shout out there. I wanted to include a slide, but I forgot to. So Frontiers in Climate, section on climate mobility. If you have research and studies after this workshop and you want to submit them, send them to me first if you want. I'll give it a read. I'll tell you if it's up to snuff or not, but you can also just submit it directly. And so I want to encourage you to submit to the climate mobility section of Frontiers in Climate. So parentheses, advertisement over. This study was done by some colleagues, including Jesse Rabeau from American University, who I'm a close colleague of. And they really did a nice job looking at 102 studies and basically looking at how the studies are shaped by conceptual framing, data sources, and region. But then they identified those groups of studies that some of which largely ignored, and 33 fully engaged with the context of migration decisions and vulnerability of those exposed to climate change. And then 24 were sort of in between the ignoring. And so this is pretty bad. Like if almost 50% of our studies don't take into account what's going on at the local level. And that's where you guys have a huge advantage over all of these northern researchers who are spewing out, statistical study upon statistical study, but rarely going to the field to see what's really going on. So you have a real advantage in this area, and I encourage you to contribute to the literature. All right. I'm off my soapbox now. I'm back on the ground, and let's keep going. So systematic reviews. This is an example of a very early one where the UK government, for the UK Foresight Report in 2011, led by Richard Black, I've referred to this a few times, basically produced a really excellent review that had, that diagram I showed you where environmental factors are coming in from the bottom left and they're affecting the social and the demographic and the economic and all these other things. So that was an important finding that they came up with, and we weren't really talking about that before they came along. The migration is undertaken to ensure income in adverse environmental situations. They say that rural-urban migration has increased in some countries because of environmental change. And then finally, they really came up with and pioneered this idea that some people, an important fraction of the world's population, may be trapped. So we're going to talk more about trapped later. Another important UK-funded effort was by UK8 a few years ago, and it was led by a guy named Jan Selby, and I'll come back to Jan Selby later when we talk about Syria. But goals of this study were to look at a huge, I mean, it's a pretty, I don't know if any of you conducted systematic reviews. I have. 273 is an awful lot of studies to look at, you know, and to really assess, like reading all those studies and assessing them. So they looked at 273 studies, he and a graduate student, and they looked at how climate change is affecting patterns of migration. Let's get on with that. This is the method. They obviously had a kind of Prisma approach to taking the literature, filtering it, identifying which studies were, you know, in and which did not qualify to be part of it. They wanted to have primarily empirical studies. They did do had some secondary reviews of empirical studies, plus some studies focused on future projections. Then they use a kind of IPCC approach to saying whether the evidence presented in those studies was very strong, medium, or limited, okay? And they wanted to qualify their findings using this kind of IPCC nomenclature. Do you all know what I'm referring to? Like if you look at an IPCC report, they say, we're certain about this, we're less certain about this. There's still more research needed in this area, that area. They had a number of hypothesized pathways about how climate variables might impact mobility, including weather shocks, long-term global and local climatic and environmental changes, local environmental and associated economic changes, which may act as pull factors for in-migration, so places that may become more attractive because of climate. Adaptation and mitigation policies, projects, and investments that might displace populations. And then the fifth bullet is perceptions and narratives. So the way that people talk about and think about the changes that are occurring around them. So let's just go to these infographics because I think they're more interesting to look at. So they summarize, one of the reasons I like this is they took the effort to actually do what most of us should be doing if we do this kind of work. They had funding to do it, so that's another reason. Foresight Report also has some really nice infographics and stuff, but this one was done particularly well. And so they basically looked at, for instance, climatic shock events, and I don't remember where they put it, but they basically say, yeah, we found evidence that climate shocks contribute to displacement and migration. You know, we can confirm that. It's fairly strong evidence. What they found was young people and people in regions relying on ag production are more likely to respond to those shocks. Women are also likely to face barriers to migration. We'll come back to that topic. The poorest people face migration pressures and barriers to movement as well. But they do find a fair amount of evidence that these climatic shock events do result in climate mobility. They found little evidence so far of impacts of long-term sea level rise and temperature and precipitation changes on migration levels. So this is a question mark. We don't really have evidence here, full evidence. In fact, there's a really great group of studies called under the DECMA project, DECCMA, and the DECMA project basically found, for instance, in places like the Volta River Basin of Ghana, and I think they did some work in the Ganges Basin and in the Mekong, that frankly, people were more likely to be moving into these areas than moving out, even though everybody's talking about deltas and the risk of delta regions to climate change because they're low-lying, flood-prone, et cetera. So that's just confirms that, you know, so far these long-term secular changes that take place over decades are not yet having an impact in the way people necessarily are moving. Adaptation responses, and I'll talk about this later today when I refer to resettlement as one policy option for climate impacts. You could have different kinds of adaptation activities and projects like dikes and mitigation projects that could actually displace populations as a result of building out those areas. If you put in a huge reservoir for hydro, that's going to have huge displacement effects. It'll be good for clean energy, but it will be result in people being displaced. So they have some evidence to suggest that these adaptation activities are affecting climate mobility. Perceptions and narratives. I think this one's really interesting. It gets back to yesterday's discussion around the internal thinking that people have. We all have internal worlds, right? We have what we present to the public, and we have what's going on in our head. And so a lot of people are actually under the impression, even if the data don't necessarily support it, that things are changing in the climate. One of the reasons is it's getting reported on daily in the newspapers and radio broadcasts that they listen to. Climate change is real, it's happening. And so automatically you start thinking, oh yeah, that drought that we just experienced was much worse than the one that I experienced 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. Of course, there's also a sense in which we weight more heavily the more recent impact. If it was a heat wave, we say, oh my God, that heat wave was the worst ever. But we kind of forget the one that was 25 years before because it was in our distant past. So all those things go to say that people actually make decisions more on the perceptions of what's going on than what actually is necessarily happening objectively. So it's just something to be aware of when you do your research that that these are real issues. Finally, they're very skeptical about future projections, and we're going to talk a lot about future projections in my next lecture. But this is an area that's controversial in the eyes of many, and they just say, well, there's not a lot of evidence that these projections are valid. They say high-end projections of climate-related migration not credible as predictions because they don't really take into account in-place or in-situ adaptation. In fact, we'll talk about groundswell, which I was involved in the next lecture, and I will say that we explicitly didn't include local adaptation because we really wanted to know what the impacts would be in the absence of adaptation measures. So I think there's reasons why we do it that way, but that was not necessarily taken into account by their critique. There are also a bunch of studies that have happened recently that have reviewed the topic of climate mobility in relation to water resources. Flood impacts typically result in short-term displacement, but if repeated may result in decisions to move out of flood-affected areas. So I had a visitor, Jan Freehart. He was with us last year for about 4 months, and I was on his committee for his PhD. He was at ETH in Zurich, and he looked and he did a long-term study. And I'm talking about 5 years, pretty long-term for a PhD dissertation in the Jamuna River basin of Bangladesh, not the Jamuna here. And basically, he found that he was able to track migrants over time. So that was one of those longitudinal studies that I was mentioning earlier, where you have multiple time points. And it was a really fascinating study. I can't do justice to it here, but the big issue in the Jamuna Basin is riverbank erosion. Every year they have massive monsoon. You're all familiar with that. It eats away at the riverbanks. And so literally people are moving their houses back 500 meters, almost every rainy season. They're losing farmland. They're losing productive land. They might rebuild on some of the chars in the middle of the river, but there's still a net land loss. So he was looking at the impacts of that kind of flood effect on migration. And he did find, in fact, there was a lot of local circular migration, especially during the non-agricultural season to places like Dhaka. Drought and secular rainfall declines and temperature increases can result in declining agricultural yields, which impacts decisions to migrate. And so there's a lot of evidence from different dryland regions that drought is affecting people's decisions to leave. Other key findings is that most migration will be internal. So this the boogeyman of south to north migration in mass is probably oversold. Temperatures and precipitation both help to explain, and I think we've already talked about that. just say that there's, I haven't even read these because every month or two I see a brand new review of literature, and I'm like, I can't keep up with all this writing that's being done on this subject. So there are a lot of other literature reviews out there, and I just put these up here. It's in your slide deck, and you can chase those down if you want to look at them. So what about evidence for climate displacement, for climate and climate conflict situations? What do we have in that area? Um, so, excuse me. You know what? I'm going to get a throat lozenge just because I don't want to protect my throat. Any questions on the first part that I just covered? All right, let's take a question or two. We have time. You can ask the question. Come on up and ask a question.
Thank you, Professor. You have been talking about the migration that is induced by the climate. So my question is that, is there any climatic catastrophe threshold exist in the perception of the people to migrate to other places? As you have taught earlier in the lectures that some people don't migrate their places even if they are flooded every year. So is there any climatic catastrophe threshold exist in the migration in terms of the perception of the people, in terms of the other push-pull factors? Thank you.
I think what you're referring to is essentially threshold effects. Like, are there routine floods that occur that people live with versus some catastrophe that occurs that washes everything away? And I would say, yeah, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that people can live in pretty harsh conditions, accommodate regular flooding, they can accommodate droughts, seasonal droughts. They have coping mechanisms. We've talked about coping capacity to deal with relatively recurrent phenomena like when I lived in the Sahel. It's not like everybody in the village that I lived in Mauritania moved because of the drought, even though it was an exceptional drought. But they had already adopted migration in part as a coping mechanism. They had adopted irrigation. So they're, let's just bring it back to our earlier discussion about coping capacities and adaptive capacities. These are things that enable people to withstand regular and fairly routine shocks. It's the extreme shocks. And then when those catastrophes occur, yeah, I think people do question whether it's possible to continue, especially if their household assets, the things that they've used traditionally to weather the storm, are eroded sufficiently over time. They've sold off all their cattle, or the cattle have died. So then they might have to move to a new condition. I know pastoralists, for instance, in northern Kenya, there was a study that Jan Van Dyne, my former postdoc of mine, was involved in, and basically at a certain point, pastoralists started selling off the cattle, and then they would buy a little plot of land and they would have a store, and they would have a little store to sell goods and things. And so they actually just moved from one. They never quite gave up everything. Like, they might have a few cows because that was their long-term cultural norm. But one thing that's also interesting to look at is ways in which people's sense of self and self-esteem is eroded because their traditional livelihood is no longer possible. So if you prided yourself in keeping animals, herding animals, and doing that successfully and making a living off of that, and suddenly you no longer have a flock of animals, or if you prided yourself on being a really good farmer, and so suddenly you've had to sell off your land, or your land is eroded and fallen into the river, these are things that erode people's sense of esteem, self-esteem. Did you want to ask a question?
My question is, in a country like India, where migration related data is very hard to get to work. So how we can think of working climate migration or migration that is happening at the local level? And another part that you have talked about is the river erosion based migration. So river erosion based migration that you have talked. So another thing is that not much literature has come from Indian context. So why this is?
I agree that India has been underrepresented in the climate mobility literature, and I look to all of you to fill those gaps. So now the charge is on you. But no, seriously, I think that there's a real need to build up a better evidence base for what's going on in India. But I'm going to show my third presentation today. If you're still awake, we'll talk about India climate mobility research that we've been involved in using a proxy measure of migration. And so I'll talk about that, but we could also open the conversation about what other possible sources of data might be available and the potential for doing field research with, it's actually relatively cheap in India compared to many other parts of the world to conduct, pretty large scale surveys, not huge, but 1,000, 2,000 households or something like that, and begin to build up that evidence base.
Is there any project that is available to work upon to get the data? Because when you will be working on 1,000 or 2,000 samples are into certain amount of cost. So what are the avenues of having a project so that we can come with it?
Okay, the avenues for funding. That's good. I mean, I don't know about Indian government research funding, and I've heard some negative stories about, they're not. And don't look to us in America either, because we're like backpedaling quickly on all of our research efforts. But I do know that periodically there are these international efforts like the Belmont Forum. There's efforts like Canada seems to have a lot of these. They had the Korea Project. They had a few others where invariably, India is one of the countries that they include because I remember the old Commonwealth and allegiance to king, queen, God, and country. Well, they would always include India in those, and I've seen a lot of research that was funded by the Canadians and maybe the UK government as well. Sure. I welcome you if you want. There's a climate mobility network that we run out of Columbia, and I try to forward any funding announcements that come. So just contact me afterwards, and I'll add you to the discussion list. It's nothing fancy, no bells and whistles. It's just a list, and I send things out to the list, and you can be apprised if there's new funding opportunities that at least that I learn of, and I'm pretty well connected, so I usually hear about stuff eventually. LinkedIn is another good way to find out about things. So if a lot of you have connected with me on LinkedIn, and so when I hear about a funding announcement, I generally forward it or repost it. Okay. All right. Now we're talking about climate displacement and climate refugees. So I mentioned in earlier discussions that talking about climate refugees is, from a legal perspective, problematic because there's no real category of refugees. But that said, it doesn't mean that climate isn't, in fact, creating a threat multiplier that may lead to situations where people are displaced or people are. And so that evidence review I just showed, pretty much made it clear that, yeah, people are being displaced. Climate is affecting people's decisions to move. I mentioned Hurricane Maria in New Orleans several times. New Orleans' population didn't necessarily shrink, ironically. What happened was a lot of the African Americans left. They went to other cities, and then it was replaced by Hispanics who were in the construction industry working to rebuild New Orleans after the floods. So, this is how the U.S. works, but there was still a lot of displacement after Hurricane Maria. Katrina, sorry, I was testing you. It's Hurricane Katrina. Maria was Puerto Rico. That was another case. A lot of empirical evidence for climate factors driving internal displacement. So I talked about, there it is, Hurricane Katrina. There's fire-related displacement. We saw tons of people in Los Angeles just earlier this year who are displaced by the fires there. Generally, it's the conventional wisdom is that people are displaced and then they return to where, and in what we're seeing in the U.S. at least is mostly people are rebuilding. They got insurance, they love where they live, they don't want to leave, and so they're rebuilding in place. Which, of course, physical scientists go berserk because they're like, "What are you doing? You're rebuilding precisely in the same place where that same disaster 10 years from now is likely to happen again, right?" But that's the American system. This is a map of displacement from the IDMC, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. And they look at all the cases of internal displacement globally and collect data on that. And what you see is the orange is conflict-related displacement, and in the blue is all the natural disasters. Now, these could include things like earthquakes, so it's not all climate. But I'll show you a slide in a second where we separate out the climate from the other variables. So some huge ones. I don't remember which blue. Well, some of these huge circles. This is Sudan. Which one is this going to? Turkey. I don't know. It's hard for me to tell where these circles. This line goes all the way up to Palestine. Obviously, in Gaza, huge displacement of populations. So those are all conflict related. However, other major conflicts, including in the Democratic Republic of Congo, but otherwise, you're talking mostly big blue circles, and many of them in places like China. This one goes to Turkey, the earthquake that occurred there. So you have some idea of what's going on. So these are the data displacements. I couldn't find an analogous graph for 2024, so this is for 2020, and it shows there were 33 million displacements, of which 25 million were new, of which 24 million were weather related, just for the climate. So, you're talking about a massively, earthquakes, geophysical events, tsunamis. Those things are small potatoes compared to weather-related events: storms, floods, cyclones, typhoons. So Fabien Coche, who I've mentioned several times, looks at things like conflict events, and there are different types of conflict events. So this is an interstate conflict example where two belligerent states are fighting each other, and they're fighting over territory or something. In the climate conflict literature, interstate conflict is generally not really focused on. Okay, but in the climate conflict literature, civil wars and insurgencies, where you have a group like in the Syrian civil war or some other group take up arms. Colombia's FARC at once upon a time was a rebel group in Colombia. And this is where a lot of the debate around climate impacts is centered. Then there's communal violence, meaning groups like the pastoralists of certain countries take up arms, the Tuareg of northern Mali, etc. Ethnic riots, those things also figure in the literature fairly widely. And then less violent conflicts like demonstrations, social movements, peaceful protests, hopefully mostly. There's some research, but a little less discussion about these things. The very summary level kind of literature, this is again based on Fabien's assessment of the literature. At the summary level, he says there's important debate about the effects of climate change on risk of violence. The literature generally suggests that climate change can contribute to increase the risk of civil war violence and communal violence. Yet most findings are generally related to the effect of temperature. Others do look at things like deviations of precipitation. Finally, the mechanisms that are usually referred to are things like resource competition between groups in areas affected by climate change, as well as grievances and opportunities. I've heard talk, and my former boss, Mark Levy, was a leader in this field, and he basically talked about opportunity costs. So when there's a drought and your crops fail, well, are you going to sit around and just like if you're angry against the government and your crop has failed and you don't have any, you're not working on cultivating the land and growing your crop, then it's maybe not such a leap to think that you might join a rebel group and actually take up arms to protest the things that the grievances that you've had over a long period of time. So that opportunity cost element is there as well, where a drought or some other extreme event might cause you, it might tip you in favor of actually taking up arms. This is some of the quantitative evidence around civil war and local violence related to temperatures, country temperatures, Pacific Ocean temperatures. This guy, Solomon Hussain, he did his PhD at Columbia, and he's become one of the big names in climate conflict literature. But he's also attracted a lot of criticism. So there have been a lot of back and forth between him and this guy named Halvard Bohag in Norway or Sweden. Here's a classic case study. How many of you had heard about this? Basically, I'll just show you some of the headlines. How many of you had read any headlines like this one about the Syria conflict? Raise your hand if you saw a headline like this about the Syria conflict. Partly as a result of one study that was conducted actually by colleagues of mine at Lamont. There wasn't a single social scientist involved in the study, so warning flag, better watch out. But they're good people. I'm not saying they're bad people, but they basically published this piece that this went like wildfire during the Syria conflict, saying climate was the basic reason for the conflict in Syria. And they based it on some good evidence, which was that there was a pretty significant drought that occurred in Syria, and that affected parts of Syria pretty badly in that 2007 to 2010 period. They say it was the worst drought in the instrumental record, causing widespread crop failure and a mass migration of farming families to urban areas. Now, they're good scientists, and they always used what's the word? They used language that was oh, come on, Alex, use your. They couch things in very kind of cautious terms, like we think this is likely, it's highly probable, blah blah blah. But the result was all these headlines that I showed you a second ago, showing that that drought caused the conflict, and people like Thomas Friedman at New York Times, who's a big environmental sort of a Malthusian, and he's a big environmental determinist type of guy. Oh yeah, drought was the cause of and so. There were indeed elements that probably exacerbated the situation in Syria, but a more careful analysis by Jan Selby, who conducted that UK aid review and went really deep into the evidence and knows a lot about Syria, or at least worked with people who know a lot about Syria. He's a geographer, by the way. Yay, our hero. He basically, kind of debunked the idea that it was really due to the drought, that this civil war was a result of the drought, and that all the civil war and therefore the displacement from the civil war was due to this drought. And he shows that, in fact, the drought was occurring in places that were not really the hotbed of dissent in Syria, and that hotbed of dissent was actually what led to, these were people who really opposed the Assad regime. So you really have to dig deep in order to be able to figure out whether some of these premises around climate and conflict are true or not. And I'm not going to go into all the details, but they also quibbled with the numbers of IDPs inside the country. You want to ask a question? You'll have to come up front. The political scientist has a question.
Professor, I wanted to ask, studies like these, and there have been numerous studies, how much are these responsible for climate skeptibility? Climate skeptibility, because climate change skeptibility basically. Yeah.
Sorry, I misattributed your discipline. I know you're also an anthropologist, but kind of working on international issues, I think. So I I don't know how much the academic debate that occurs after these headlines and after all this, really affects what public opinion is about. So I don't think climate skeptics latch on to this kind of article and say, see, it wasn't really climate. And really, climate skepticism mostly, at least in the US, I don't know about here, is mostly not about the impacts of climate change, but it's about the very reality of climate change to begin with. So the premise is that climate change is just not happening, But that's a good point. Certainly, it doesn't help that internally we academics, I think it's healthy to have debate, and I think it's healthy to actually, but it doesn't always help that sometimes we tear each other down. So one of the things I'll just say is that even though climate may not be strongly correlated with conflict or refugee flows, refugees are being impacted by climate change today. So this is work by a colleague of mine, Jamin Vandenhoek. Jamin is the guy who did all those Gaza destruction maps. If you saw the maps that showed the percent of Gaza that was being destroyed. So Jamin's a good friend of mine, and he does some really good work. He's developed this workflow for Ukraine and for Gaza, and it shows how many buildings are destroyed in an area. I haven't seen the latest update, but I fear that probably most of Gaza has now basically been reduced to rubble. But what you see here is refugee settlements in 2019. Pretty much all of them, notice, are in the global south, so there just aren't that many northern countries that are willing to host refugee settlements. And when you look at the future projections, this is looking out to 2060, roughly mid-century, changes in or likely future temperatures. You see average annual temperatures in areas that are hosting refugees rising substantially, and precipitation potentially declining in some of those same areas too. Especially in the Western Sahel and Turkey and places that are currently hosting. So I've actually been part of some panels that UNHCR organized where they were asking the question of how do we need to better prepare refugee camps for future climate risks? Because the tents that the UNHCR issues, standard issue tents, do not take climate change into account. They're probably very, very hot during the hot part of the day. Okay, so now we're going to turn to, I think, almost the last section. And this section is evidence for involuntary immobility. So one of the topics that I got interested in is the topic of habitability. I've been working with a colleague, David Rathel, who's also at Oregon State. Jamin is at Oregon State. David's at Oregon State. So we have a nice relationship with Oregon State University. And also another colleague at Columbia, Radley Horton, who's focused a lot on extreme heat. And we started asking the question around whether habitability is a useful construct or not for understanding future climate mobility. And so we published this piece in Science, and basically we define habitability as the conditions in a particular setting that are conducive to a healthy human life, productive livelihoods, and sustainable intergenerational development. And afterwards, I realized that cost has to be a consideration. So yeah, you could potentially live on Mars, but what is the cost? You can also put up a research station on the South Pole, but what is the cost? So yeah, that's habitable technically, but there's a huge cost associated. So you need to think about cost as well. The challenges to habitability from climate change include things like basic human survival, livelihood security. And I think this is really critical. We talked a lot about adaptive capacity this week. societies themselves, the ability to adapt may itself be strained as climate change increases. I talked a little bit about the drain on the public purse from climate disasters, from adaptation projects and things like that, infrastructure to manage climate risk. And so it's going to start impacting the ability of society to manage. Even if a society is well governed, and that's no guarantee in this day and age, but even if it's well governed, it still will have cost implications. What we wanted to do in that article was maybe challenge a little bit the narrative around these like hotspots of global climate impacts, where certain areas are going to see massive. This is a recent article by Zhu et al. And PNAS, and it basically said some areas based on high temperatures, future temperature extremes may no longer be suitable for habitation in the future. And they talked a little bit about, well, numbers of people that might have to move. But even going back to 20 years or so, there were early efforts to map places that will likely see massive climate impacts. This is an example of some work that kind of looks at the sweet spot for human habitability and changes in how climate variables may change that sweet spot and make some areas less desirable. And they also coupled that with some demographic projections to show how some regions have rapidly growing populations, but also the climate is likely to be less conducive in the future to habitability. And part of the way they do this kind of work, just as a background, is they look at like population density by certain latitudes and by certain temperature zones. And there are, in fact, strong correlations. Like there's a certain bracket of temperature, I don't have the exact numbers in my head, but where you find like 80 to 90% of the world's population, okay? And if you start moving outside of that, that window of temperature, you may start to see some migration. There's also, these kind of more catastrophist views on the future of civilization itself. Some of you may have seen this article, but there's an increasing number of these kinds of articles coming out that are looking at this sort of thing. So we asked the question, well, is it valid to do this top-down modeling, or could, and we, you're not going to stop the physical scientists, frankly, from producing these kinds of model outputs, right? Because they have the data, they're going to run the exercise no matter what. So could we use some of that information and actually work at the more grassroots level to develop adaptation approaches? And this is just to show that, I told you this diagram, I would bring it back later in my lecture series. So I'm good to my word. And so remember, this is the intensity of impacts from an event and the frequency of those impacts. And so some things might be like, just look at rice, for instance. Rice, again, there's these windows of temperature in which rice can grow. Beyond that temperature window, if it's flowering and if it's reproducing, yields will go down. Thank you. You illustrated perfectly what someone's doing in the back. He's doing the hand movement. So yields will go down substantially. So for every degree increase in temperature, you'll see a 10% decline in rice production, therefore loss of farmer livelihoods and security of the supply of the staple crop. And so this is an example of a diagram that could be used to say, you might infer from that farmers in certain rice growing regions will have to move. And so there's, an increasing literature that's looking at when migration can occur in anticipation of or in response to climate hazards, changes and observed. So migration patterns often emerge often after other attempts to adapt locally have been exhausted. So that's the key point. And are like to emerge when non-climate factors such as poverty, inequality, limited participation, so in other words, all those political economy factors constrain local adaptive capacity. This is another quote where they're basically talking about the likelihood of migration as a result of climate tipping points. So where I didn't include the slide, and I should have, but where we landed on that science article was basically that there is going to be a lot of need to work locally. And again, I encourage all of you, the degree that you also can bridge your research and your interest in understanding to actually use that understanding to then propose changes and to propose locally adaptive solutions. That's where I think a lot of the action is going to need to be, is locally adaptive solutions. Even though these global approaches may be doom and gloom, there are reasons for hope. Finally, evidence for trap populations. This is another paper I was involved in, and basically it just came out earlier this year. And they make the point, it's largely policy-oriented paper, and that paper is saying we need to think about the reality that some people aren't going to be able to move. But it also requires special research approaches, because you need to go to the field and actually ask people. Like, evidence of migration is clear, right? People move, and you can collect data on those movements, and you can then infer that they move because of agricultural or other livelihood concerns. But when people don't move, you don't have that immediate signal that there's a problem, that there's something going on in this region. So then it becomes potentially more moving into the realm of a humanitarian situation where people might not have the enough food or whatever. So you need to do research that accommodates an understanding that there may be, that migration is not the only response, that there is actually trapped or involuntary immobility going on in some regions. So this is from the ACMI, the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative, which we were involved as well. And 54% of the population interviewed in these rural and some urban settings in Africa, but mostly rural, said they're not considering moving at all, so they don't want to move. 23% considering moving but lack the resources to do it. Another just sort of daydreaming about it possibly. Some are actually planning to move, and others already moved, and they move seasonally. But we know that not everyone can move, and so there need to be accommodations for those who can't. There's also huge gender disparities in who can move and who can't. So women typically have a greater burden of household responsibilities, taking care of kids, maybe elderly family members, and so they're not as likely to be considering moving, and they're not as likely to be actually moving. You see the percentages are lower for the women in the red. I don't know if we really want to go. I have about 3 minutes, so I don't think I'll go into these. We've done a lot of work. This is sort of early work that I was involved in. I remember I told you about the mapping exercises we did to complement case studies in different parts of the world, and that was all basically looking at livelihood issues in different regions like the Mekong Delta, parts of southern Mexico. And that was just an early policy-oriented report that we worked on. Then we've done work on our weather shocks and crop prices and regional migration in West Africa. So the short answer is that, yeah, crop prices are related to mobility between countries. This is an example of using the IOM flow monitoring data. These are data that are collected on the ground in the Sahel and in West Africa, where they go to bus stations and they go to border crossings, and they basically ask people why they're moving, why they're going one place or another. And if they say that they're moving long term to go somewhere else, or they're going to Europe or whatever, they make a note of that. But what you can do with these data, which is kind of cool, is you can actually work with them in conjunction with climatic stressor data and see whether the temporal dimension of those movements relates to crop stress or other things. So that's something that Fabien Cotier has been working on. So this is just snapshots. I mentioned work we were doing comparing West Africa and Central America. Remember that resilience, those cups that I had modeling resilience. So we tried to use those cups to suggest that there might be a move um, into a new state of the system. Okay, so this is all about system dynamics, from people basically moving, mostly young men or men, moving from Central America to North America, uh, and just going to support their family that they leave behind, to a new status where there's more and more unaccompanied migrants and entire families who are leaving Central America and moving to North America. So, what were some of the reasons for that? We identify things like the political economy, informal institutions, efforts, and climate change, making this cup more shallow so that more people are moving in to, and of course, border policy might be forcing people back as well. But there are a lot of things like social media and drug smuggling networks that are set up by narco traffickers to move people across the border. They already move heroin, they move mostly cocaine, but other drugs across the border. It's not that hard to move people once you figure out how to move drugs across. So these things are all affecting the balance of who's moving and why. And so you've seen this already. This is some efforts that I'll talk about later. And these are some of the published reports that we have. So maybe we'll stop there, and we'll open up to any questions that anyone has.
Thank you so much, sir, for this morning lecture. My question is we have chalked out about the migrants, and the migrant data still we are in the process of it. But what about the cities, mega cities in India like Mumbai and Delhi, which are obviously oversaturated right now, and they have a fair amount of floating population. Like they are from the nearby pockets and nearby areas, and they come in the morning by morning commute, work throughout the day, have their life spent there, and they just go back through commuter trains or commuter connectivity things at their office hours to their abode back to the nearby. So how to chalk up, and they fairly contribute to the city activities, be it economic activities and all of that, because they are working class probably. So, sir, how to is the challenge of floating population to chalk out that migrants are there, but the floating population data is not easily available. So, how to address this challenge?
Um, I don't know how to address the challenge of gathering data, but I think you raise an important potential research area, which is disruptions to commutes and the effects that that has on people's livelihoods. If you're depending heavily on work, and you need that income, but a climate shock disrupts your ability to get to work, that's a big issue. And certainly we've seen it in the U.S. with some climate shocks, Hurricane Sandy in New York, which basically for an entire week people were out of work at least, and maybe longer in some cases. Not to mention the fact that they lost all the food in the refrigerator or that sort of thing. So I think it's a good question. As far as like data on that sort of thing, I don't have a solution, but maybe public transport ridership statistics might be a possible solution. But if people are taking, what do they call the three wheelers? The little taxis. Hmm? Yeah, if they're taking other things, the other means that are informal forms of transportation, that might not be captured as well. Are there any other questions? We can. Yeah. Sorry? Yeah, but that's where you would get, presumably, you get some information on ticket purchases and stuff like that. This is where being creative. The other thing that people are using increasingly is smartphones, right? So, if you can get access to the data on movements from smartphones, it's not easy, but, but the cell services, there's the group FlowMinder has been using cell phone data for about a decade or more. and they've developed a whole approach to, MOUs with these cell phone providers to get data on daily things like daily commutes.
So there are certain regions in India that have experienced massive migration from many decades, and some of those regions are in Himalayas that have actually seen large migration. So, if from a historical point of view, if you want to look into whether those migration resulted from climate events or not, so what methods or what approach should we have in that case? And the second question is about my own experience of working in the field on this environmental change and migration. So, I've observed that it's not the so it takes almost a decade or many years to realize people that their environment have deprived, and the only option they are left is to migrate. Yeah, you can the first one.
So the constructing careful studies in this area is challenging. So I'll just say that up front. It's not altogether easy because you do need a lot of data. And I may have slightly misspoken earlier. I mentioned these studies in South America that looked at interprovincial migration. So that might be a good example of a study you would want to look at, because they did, in fact, control for some things like income, education. So those are generally available from census data. You can know, whether people are well educated, they have higher or lower income, and those could be highly predictive. What they probably didn't have as much information on is very localized contextual factors that might be really important to know about, that are often more difficult to incorporate in these kind of statistical models. So I think in India, I know I think it's a data-rich country, but frankly, for some reason, and I don't know quite why, it's also a country that's very. I may be wrong here, but my perception from my own work in this is it's very hard to get access to the data. The data exists, but you don't get them online. They're not just posted online. And I hope that maybe I know that this university has some very high level civil servants that come out of it. You should be over there talking to the public affairs students saying open data is critical to research. If you want to understand your society and you want to understand what's going on, you need open data. That cultural change will result in basically your ability to conduct a lot more rich analyses. But as long as the government says those data are ours and we're not going to let go of them, that's a problem. I don't want to upset any apple carts or smash any idols or whatever the metaphor is. But the reality is, every country that has gone towards more open data has advanced by light years over countries that restrict access to data intensely. It's just, you see it. And even in places in Africa where they've opened the data up, small industries start springing up, small to medium sized enterprises. And instead of like government sometimes says, well, we can't give all that data away. We spent so much money collecting them. They're valuable. We're going to keep them. It's power. It's other things. But when they let go of those data, they actually generate far more tax revenue than the cost of collection, because they start spawning spatial data industries and secondary analytical firms that say, I'll be your consultant. I'll go and do that analysis that you want for you. And that meaning the big corporation or whatever. And they get, they're able to make a good living. So with that, I think we'll break for coffee or tea, and we'll be back here at what time? What time will we be back here? 30 minutes? Okay. Sorry? Oh, only 15 minutes, I'm being told. So